Commencing our readings with excerpts from letters and diaries of servicemen, women and their families is Sub-Lieutenant Zenaida Adams, representing the Royal Australian Navy.
For nearly 2 weeks in August 1900, around 300 Australians and 200 Rhodesian troops were besieged at Ellens River by 2,000 to 3,000 enemy Boer troops. Their successful defence of the post earned them fame in Australia. Captain David John Ham of the Victorian Citizens Bushmen wrote from the battlefield, "Through the hail of lead we took up our place there, and lying behind only 6 inches of cover, heard the whistle of bullets just like a hive of bees, swarming, splattering and splintering the rocks. The shells screeched in broken fragments above our bodies. It looked as if there had been none of us left as we welcomed the setting sun. I had often wondered how I would feel under fire. Well, all through the day I never felt the least anxiety for myself, and I felt I would come out of it perfectly safe. I listened to the shells shrieking and the bullets humming and singing with a certain amount of indifference. Now and then, jokes were cracked. At the same time, I heard the groans of the dying and wounded men. Some were cursing, some praying, and still the carnage went on. By night, we were like a lot of rabbits in a burrow. We have been told that the Boers cannot shoot, but that is all nonsense." Sergeant Arthur Blackburn of the 10th Battalion wrote about the death of his good friend, Private Thomas Anderson White, a fellow member of the Adelaide Rowing Club, who had volunteered to row one of the boats ashore during the Gallipoli landings on the morning of the 25th of April 1915. The men of the transports had partly to be towed and partly to be rowed ashore amidst a hail of shrapnel and bullets that was simply indescribable. Now, the most dangerous position of the lot was that of the men who were rowing, as they of course could take no shelter. They could not even crouch down in the boat, but were compelled to sit up and row. The dangers of such a task were so apparent that officers often hesitated to order men to expose themselves to the work of rowing. Tom immediately grasped the situation, and as everyone knew he would, volunteered his service as a rower. As the boat crept in towards the shore, the fire became hotter and hotter. The men rowing had a terrible time, but they stuck to it in a way which was absolutely magnificent. Just as the boat touched the shore, Tom slipped over on the bottom of the boat, and it was discovered then that he was badly hit. He was at once taken to the hospital ship, but died from the wounds he had received before reaching Egypt. As you will see, the poor fellow was killed before he had fired a single shot. But there is no doubt that it was largely due to the courage and endurance of Tom and his fellow rowers that in all the boats that everyone was landed with the minimum of loss. He was joking and laughing all the way to the shore, and our battalion has lost one of its best soldiers. Walter Smale was the son of a Yagera woman from Freestone in Queensland. He landed on Gallipoli in July 1915 as part of the 2nd Light Horse Regiment and was killed at Quinn's Post on the 7th of August 1915. His good friend, Private Charles Stanley, wrote to Smale's grieving mother, recounting the circumstances of her son's death. "Your son was killed at Quinn's Post, at Garber Teep, and he was in the very forefront of the line. He was a bomb thrower, whose job was to throw bombs into the enemy's trenches to give the men with the bayonets a chance to get their footing. He was picked for this because of his good throwing powers. He could hurl a bomb 50 yards and hit the trench nearly every time. He had to do this on the day of the charge. With others, he had to climb out of our trenches and run to the enemy's, carrying 10 to 12 bombs in the face of very heavy fire. He died on the parapet of the enemy's trench, a brave man to the last." Private Arthur Morgan recalled the landing at Anzac Cove. "One shot went whistling and screaming over the top of our ship just as we were getting down the ladders into the lifeboats. After the boats were full, we had to row about half a mile to the shore. When we got about 50 yards from it, the Turks opened fire on us, the bullets whistling round in all directions, and churning up the water, giving us a shower bath. Some of our chaps were shot before we reached the shore, including one of the officers. When the boat struck bottom, I jumped into the sea, getting wet up to my jacket, and did a sprint to cover. The rest did the same. By the time we were all together, all but 3 of us had been hit. We were given orders to be quiet and not to move, as the snipers had our range. After lying there for an hour, I got another bullet. 3 hours later, the Army Medical Corps came along and I was shifted to the beach, thence to a lifeboat, and from there to a Red Cross boat where my wounds were tended to. There wasn't a dozen out of the 2 boatloads able to go forward. That's the worst of being the landing party. Sister Lydia King, aboard the hospital ship HMHS Cecilia, was deeply affected by what she saw of the casualties coming from Gallipoli. I shall never forget the awful feeling of hopelessness one night on night duty. It was dreadful. I had 2 wards downstairs, each over 100 patients, and then I had a small ward upstairs. Altogether, about 250 patients to look after. I shall not describe their wounds. They were too awful. One loses sight of all the honour and the glory in the work we are doing. Lieutenant Willie Mann of Charters Towers in Queensland was among the first Australian troops to file into the trenches of the Western Front in France. Looking forward to the prospect of engaging the main enemy in the main theatre of war, he told his family in June 1916, "I'll do my best to return to you, but if I do get a smack, you will have nothing to be ashamed of, and nobody will be able to say that you gave birth to a son who was afraid to die and would rather promenade the street than fight with honour of their parents and sister. For as sure as night follows day, Belgium's fate would have been England's and Australia's if the Germans had their own way." Sergeant Herbert Davies was among a number of men of the 57th Battalion who participated in a trench raid against the German positions near Armentières in July 1916. Each man in the raiding party had a certain job to do, and he had to be a specialist in it. We were trained for 3 weeks, just like a football team. When we did our dash, all went like clockwork, except one thing. A piece of shrapnel got me through the left thigh. One of our chaps managed to get me out to a drain about the centre of no man's land. It was impossible to get back to our own trenches until Fritz's bombardment lifted. The beggars then started spraying with machine guns and shrapnel. We had to lie there for an hour and 3/4 before their guns lifted off our trenches. Second Lieutenant Simon Fraser was a farmer from Viaduct in Victoria. On the 31st of July 1916, he wrote home describing the Battle of Fromelles, the first major action involving Australians on the Western Front. "We must have brought in over 250 wounded men by our company alone. It was no light work getting in with a heavy weight on your back, especially if he had a broken leg or arm. You had to lie down and get him on your back, then rise and duck for your life with the chance of getting a bullet in you before you were safe. One foggy morning, we could hear someone over towards the German entanglements calling for a stretcher bearer. It was an appeal no man could stand against. So some of us rushed out and had a hunt. We found a fine haul of wounded and brought them in, but it was not where I'd heard this fellow calling. So I had another shot for it and came across a splendid specimen of humanity trying to wiggle into a trench with a big wound in his thigh. Another man about 30 yards out sang out, "Don't forget me, cobber." And I went in and got 4 volunteers with stretchers, and we got both men in safely. Fraser died during the fighting at Bulcourt in May 1914, aged 40, and has no known grave. The Australians were drawn into even heavier fighting on the Somme in July and August 1916. In 6 weeks at Pozières and Moquet Farm, they suffered 23,000 casualties, around 7,000 of those being killed. Lance Corporal Arthur Dean wrote to the mother of Private Len Chibnall about her son's death at Pozières in July 1916. On the morning of July 25th, our company was called up to reinforce another battalion. We had to bomb the enemy out of one of his own trenches. Some went up to throw bombs, and others, including Len, were sniping from the sides of the trench. Presently, the call came for fresh bombers. Len, having had some training in bomb throwing, went up to the end of the trench nearest the Germans, and I took his rifle. That was the last I saw of him. They told me he resumed sniping. Others told me he was very eager and jumped on the parapet of the trench, calling, "Come on, Australia." Then one of the enemy snipers shot him dead with a bullet in the back of his neck. He could not have died more gloriously, and I am sure you will feel proud to be the mother of a boy who fought so gallantly and died so gamely. It was a day of valiant deeds, but I feel sure no one was more fearless than my young friend. And I know you will cease to mourn his going when you learn how magnificently he fell. Surely God will be very kind to one who knew so well how to die. Charles Bean cheated death many times, and he already carried a wound from his early days on Gallipoli. He described a typical excursion to the front in September 1917. We pushed along the battered trench until we found an officer. The men were in little undercut posies in the side of the trench. We passed two in neighbouring posies with a blood-splashed waterproof sheet covering the entrance, and the flies buzzing around the blood-stained legs and putties which protruded. Otherwise, we should not have known the men were not alive. We came at last to the officer, a poor little startled boy, horrified by the sights of the shelling. Australian official war photographer Frank Hurley recorded some of the most iconic images of the First World War. In Belgium, following the Battle of Brutzing in October 1917, Hurley witnessed the aftermath of an Australian attack. Every 20 paces or less lay a body, some frightfully mutilated, without legs, arms, or heads, and covered in mud and slime. God knows how those red-tabbed blighters at headquarters, 60 miles from the front, expect our men to gain such a strong position when they have to drag themselves through mud. Curse them. I swear they were not within 20 miles of the firing line when this attack was arranged. The ground is impassable. Sergeant Walter Downing of the 57th Battalion was among the 15th Brigade's assaulting columns that formed up just before midnight on the 24th of April 1918 in preparation for a counterattack on German positions at Villers-Bretonneux. The moon sank behind the clouds. There were houses burning in the town, throwing a sinister light on the scene. It was past midnight. Men muttered, "It's Anzac Day," smiling to each other, enlivened by the omen. There was no artillery firing on either side, and we were glad. All was quiet as a grave. Then a snarl came from the throat of the mob, the fierce low growl of tigers scenting blood. There was a howling as of demons at the 57th, fighting mad, drove through the wire, through the 59th, who sprang to their sides, through their enemy, baying like hellhounds, they also charged. The wild cry rose in a voluminous, vengeful roar that was heard by the 13th Brigade far on the fight of Villers-Bretonneux. There was no quarter on either side. Private William Ray was a letterpress machinist from Marrickville, Sydney, who died during the Battle of Amiens on the 8th of August 1918. He is buried at Villers-Bretonneux Military Cemetery, where a poignant epitaph written by his grieving parents appears on his headstone. Another life lost, hearts broken for what? On the day of the armistice, 11th of November 1918, Charles Bean wrote in his diary, "The change went too deep for outward rejoicing. Life continued as usual, except for the cessation of actual fighting. The sound of guns ceased, the gates of the future silently opened." Sir William Arbuthnot Lane, director of the Cambridge Military Hospital in the First World War, wrote, "It's the poor devils without noses and jaws, the unfortunates of the trenches who come back without the faces of men. People who look like some of these creatures haven't much of a chance."
Ladies and gentlemen, continuing the readings and representing the Royal Australian Air Force is Corporal Laura Pearson.
During the Second World War, Acting Corporal John Johnson from the 2nd 23rd Battalion wrote a letter home to his wife and 7 children in Australia, describing life during the siege of Tobruk. Just endeavouring to write you a few lines under rotten conditions. There are dozens of things I'd like to tell you, but of course this is out of the question. The fleas are very bad here, but we are issued with powder, which I think they must eat and enjoy, because they still crawl on you all night, despite the use of the stuff. Picture armed cars, tanks, trucks, motorbikes, men, guns, hospital tents, holes in the ground, shells bursting, artillery firing, aeroplanes flying, aircraft guns in action. Nighttime air raids, flares, signal bullets, red, green, white, searchlights, anti-aircraft shell bursting all over the sky, flash and flare of guns firing, war. A month later, Johnson was shot during the fighting in an area of Tobruk known as the Salient. He refused medical attention until others had been attended to, and died later that day. When the British battlecruiser HMS Repulse was sunk in late 1941, Lieutenant Paul Hayes was told by the medical officer of the rescuing ship that one of his 17-year-old Australian midshipmen was seriously wounded. Hayes later wrote to his wife about this young Australian officer. Among the other midshipmen, this young man had appeared the least developed. Immature for his age, and often in trouble, he had seemed and looked a near child. He had been hit at his action station by a machine gun bullet from the last strafing run by a Japanese aircraft. I asked to be alone with him and took his hand. He gave me a brave smile, which knifed into my heart and conscience for the previous admonishment I had bestowed on him. He held onto my hand with a firm little grip, as though trying to express his last tangible feelings in the young life he must have known was slipping from him. I have never before or since seen death or the awareness of death in that moment of truth so transform youth to man. Suddenly he was adult, brave, and silently perceptive of the tragedy in which we were both enmeshed. He died that evening. Sergeant Jack Sim of the 39th Battalion described the conditions along the Kokoda Trail in Papua during 1942. Oh, it was murderous. It was that hard. You know what was our worst enemy? The terrain. You perspired all day. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon it would rain, so you were continually wet. And it was cold at night. It was so cold at night and boiling hot in the daytime. Some prayed, some swore with fear, but you couldn't show it in front of your mates. One of the boys got shot fair between the eyes right alongside of me. It was a perfect shot. Buggers. They used to attack us by screaming out. Terrible to be afraid. Yet it's the brave ones that are afraid and still keep going. That's what they did, you know. Scared bloody stiff and still kept going. They were so young. They were so young. I loved them all. Nobody went to that war, or any other, I suppose, that didn't get wounded mentally, if not physically. It wasn't possible. Enduring brutal captivity as a prisoner of war of the Japanese, Sergeant Stan Arneal described the return of members of the 2nd 30th Battalion to the Changi prison camp in late 1943 after toiling on the Burma-Thailand railway. It was a moonlight night, and Changi, with the tropical waters around the island, was so beautiful. I can still hear the squeal of the brakes as the trucks lined up. The people from Changi knew we were coming, and they came over to see us, to look for old friends and see how we were. We got out of the trucks. A couple were dead, and we laid them on the ground, and we lined up on the road. We were not ashamed because we were soldiers, and we wanted to look like soldiers. The people from Changi stood back and uttered not a word. It was really quite strange. We lined up on the road as best we could and stood up as straight as we could. Those who couldn't stand up straight were on sticks, and those who couldn't stop shaking with malaria were held by their friends. We thought this was what we should do as soldiers, to say that we were not beaten. The Sergeant Major dressed us off, and we stood in a straight line as he went over and reported to Major Johnston. Johnston went over to Black Jack Galligan, and he said, "Your 2nd 30th, all present and correct, sir." And Galligan said, "Where are the rest?" The Major said, "They're all here, sir." And we were. Blackjack Galligan, the Iron Man, broke down and cried. It was an incredible scene. We wanted to show them we were soldiers. Pilot Officer Neil Denyer of Tumbarumba, New South Wales, and Flying Officer Michael Shanahan of Sydney were among the 7-man crew of the Lancaster Arthur Robert from No. 156 Squadron, Royal Air Force, that disappeared during a raid on Berlin in September 1943. The aircraft was last heard from on takeoff just before 8 p.m, but owing to the need to maintain radio silence, it was unclear at what point during the raid the aircraft disappeared. Arthur Robert was one of 22 British bombers that failed to return from Berlin that night. Patricia Shanahan, the wife of Arthur Robert's pilot, wrote to the parents of Neil Denyer, expressing her sympathy at this anxious time. "I want to say I have every hope that Michael and all the crew are safe, and we will hear of them as prisoners of war soon. I have a tiny daughter, just 1 year and 9 months old, and I'm sure her daddy will come back to us. Do try and feel the same way about Neil, it does help a little." No further news was ever established as to what happened, and so in April 1944, the families of Neil Denyer and Michael Shanahan were formally told that the crew of Arthur Robert had been killed in the raid on Berlin. They have no known graves. Instead, their names appear on the Runnymede Air Force's memorial in Surrey, England. Neil Denyer was 22 years old. Michael Shanahan was 28. On the 5th of June 1944, the night before the Allied invasion of Normandy, or D-Day, Sub-Lieutenant Richard Peary, Royal Australian Navy Volunteer Reserve, wrote a letter home from aboard the British landing ship HMS Invicta. "Well, my dears, the pressure is on now, and soon the weather improves. We sail for the greatest event in the history of the world. By the time you receive this, you will surely have heard some of the bare details. This is the greatest armada that ever was formed, a colossal feat of organisation, the product of years of planning and hard work." The letter remained unfinished. The next morning, Peary was commanding a landing craft in the first wave heading towards Juno Beach in the Allied invasion of France. He was killed instantly when his craft simultaneously struck a mine and was hit by enemy artillery. In the final year of the Second World War, 26-year-old South Australian Lieutenant Colin Simper wrote to his wife, Irene, mother of his 2 young children. "I don't think you understand my position here, honey. Admittedly, I see a lot of dead and a lot of killing, but it's only the man who has it day and night for months on end that is liable to get affected by it. No, I think you may rest assured that it won't affect me any less unless it's to make me love you more and look forward to peace and our life together." Colin Simper died of wounds received on Tarakan Island, Borneo, on the 9th of June 1945. During times of war and peace, Australian men and women have been motivated to serve our nation for many different reasons. Captain Reg Saunders served in the Army during the Second World War and the Korean War. He fought in the Middle East, Crete, New Guinea, and at Kapyong. He was a proud Aboriginal Australian. "I never fought for anybody but Australia. I always was loyal to my country. I fought for the Queen of Australia, or the King of Australia. I didn't want the King or the Queen of England because I'd have been just as happy fighting against them. Australia is my country. I love my country very much, and I like the people in Australia, so my loyalty was purely Australian. We were the first defenders of Australia. The English never ever defended Australia at all. We did, and we suffered very badly for that. Decimated to hell." During the Korean War, Lieutenant Colin Kahn of the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, was wounded during a night patrol on the 11th of November 1952. "I remember dying. I went up into the air and I saw myself lying on that hill, dead. I was in no pain. I was terribly content and happy. I thought of my wife and I thought I had to come back, and then it all started to hurt." Writing many years after the conflict, Sergeant Brian Cooper, recipient of the Military Medal, recalled his time serving with the 2nd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. I believe the experience I had of war in Korea at the age of 19 years had a more profound effect on my personal life and subsequent behaviour than any other event before or since. That experience shaped my personality in ways I think I would have preferred to have avoided, and much of what I was when I returned from Korea is still with me today. In Vietnam, the speed of helicopter medical evacuation saved lives, but there was no time to take in, let alone mourn, the loss of a mate. Ian Kavanagh of 2 RAR recalled, "Having a bloke killed, they just take them out and you keep going on your operation. So it might be another 3 weeks before you get back. And when you get back, there's probably another bloke there. There is nothing to suggest that that other bloke lived there. His locker's cleaned out, all his gear is gone, everything. They just disappeared. It's as if they were never there. It's terrible, this grieving process. You know, we didn't have time." American Sergeant Gerard Delarue formed part of Mike Force, a US Army Special Forces team that trained Indigenous Montagnard people in counter-guerrilla warfare during the Vietnam War. As well as working with Vietnam's locals, Delarue was one of a skilled and experienced group of advisors from the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam. 52 years ago this year, on the 24th of May 1969, Delarue and his Mike Force battalion were involved in a major engagement with North Vietnamese forces near Ben Ket in Kon Tum Province, South Vietnam. As the Mike Force battalion moved onto an undefended hill, the 2 forward companies of soldiers were immediately hit with rockets, mortars, and machine gun fire from North Vietnamese positions, causing 2 companies of Montagnard soldiers to falter. An Australian advisor, Warrant Officer Keith Payne, rushed forward firing his Armalite rifle and hurling grenades at the enemy. Attempting to keep the North Vietnamese at bay while rallying his men, Payne was wounded by 4 pieces of shrapnel and 1 piece of mortar in his hands, upper arms, and hips. Delarue described Payne's action over the following hours. "We had moved off of the beaten trails by the withdrawing soldier in the hope that if the enemy did follow, they would stick to the larger trails. We were planning on staying there and treating the wounded until the other advisors who were with us, who had gone to get help, could return. Our situation appeared hopeless." At this time, approximately 2100 hours, Warrant Officer Payne, who by this time could have easily been back at the former night location and a position of safety, arrived at our position. How he found us, I'll never know. He had found out somehow that myself and other Americans, Australians, and Montagnards were back there with wounded. He said he followed our phosphorus glowing in the dark. He insisted the North Vietnamese would find us as he did, if not soon, then in the morning. From past experiences with Warrant Officer Payne, I know he has about the coolest head when things seem to be the worst. Despite all that had happened, he had his interpreter, his radio man, all his gear, 40 Montagnards, and he had found us. After continuous effort and insistence, Warrant Officer Payne made arrangements for a dust-off with a jungle penetrator. During the 3 hours that followed, under Warrant Officer Payne's expert leadership and confidence, the rest of the men, to include the wounded, made it back to battalion headquarters safely. For his actions that day in Kon Tum Province, Warrant Officer Keith Payne of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam was awarded the Victoria Cross, one of 4 awarded to Australians during the Vietnam War.
Ladies and gentlemen, our final reader for the Australian Army is Corporal Rhys Williams.
Sergeant Terry Pickard of the Royal Australian Army Medical Corps describes his experience in DPO while serving with the United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda in 1995. I saw Corporal Paul Jordan yelling and waving at one child who was confused about which way to go. Jordan was trying to get this boy to come to us, but he was so scared that he froze. With so many rounds flying above, he would not have lasted long. It was then that I saw Jordan do the most amazing and bravest thing I've ever witnessed. He ran to the boy who was stuck in the area under intense fire, grabbed him in both arms and ran back to us. So I put the boy in the back of the truck where Nico was looking after several refugees awaiting evacuation to the landing zone. He then went back to the patient, he'd been treating as if nothing had happened. On the 24th of April 2004, Commanding Officer of HMAS Stuart Phillips, being PSC AM, was acting as Task Unit Commander for a group of ships charged with responsibility for maritime security in the North Arabian Gulf, including the protection of Iraq's 2 offshore oil terminals. Towards sunset, a coordinated waterborne IED suicide attack was mounted against the terminals. A small boat with a boarding party from the US patrol boat USS Fireball intercepted a traditional dhow fishing vessel that was behaving somewhat erratically and approaching the northern of the 2 terminals. As the boarding party came alongside, the dhow crew detonated a large IED. All 7 members of the boarding party and crew were seriously injured. A Seahawk helicopter was directed to respond. In the semi-dark, the air crew could see a mess of oil and debris in the water, and amongst the mess, people struggling to stay afloat. The air crew attempted to winch up one man up into the helicopter using a rescue strap, but he was too weak. The man was starting to slip beneath the sea surface, so the decision was made to deliver leading seaman Air Crewman Ben Syme into the water to render assistance. Wearing only his normal flight gear, he was dropped into the sea and attempted to keep the man afloat until one of HMAS Stuart's boats could render assistance, which ended up being some 10 to 15 minutes later. Over that 10 to 15 minutes, 2 high-speed boats attempted an attack. They were taken under fire and exploded before reaching their target. However, Ben Syme was on his own in the water, in the dark, trying to keep the US sailor alive and afloat, while these large explosions rippled across the sea surface. I think we all knew at the time that the events of the 24th of April were significant on a strategic, operational and tactical level. But I know that personally, I didn't realise what a significant and ongoing impact it would have on many people's lives. I am one of the lucky ones. I can recall the incident clearly, but I'm not troubled by those memories. I still feel a sense of pride in what our people did and the results we achieved. But it has handed me to learn over time the number of people who are haunted or challenged by what occurred and what they went through. Leading Seaman Matthew Bryson was a combat system operator on watch in the ops room of the Stuart when the first explosion occurred. We didn't have much in the way of spare people, so I moved to the boat space to help launch the rib to help with the casualties. We saw the second explosion from the boat space and were still at action stations not long after the casualties began to arrive. When the rib first arrived alongside, it looked like it had 1,000 things going on. Bandages, blood, wounded, CPR, but also too many people. There are a few wounded who managed to climb the jumping ladder, including one US sailor with what appeared to be serious hearing damage among other abrasions. He asked me what had hit them and also asked where we needed him. Despite his injuries and shock, he still wanted to work and help out. I helped him to the ship's medical emergency team, who were quickly onto him though. It's memories like that stick around. The injured sailor that wanted to help, every single person thriving under the circumstances, including individuals going above and beyond. The state of passageways, the activity in the ops room after the alarm calls were made, and the comms and US military presence also came to life. And then, everyone tuning up for dawn service the next morning. Those memories will never leave, nor will I want them to. Sergeant C. Fallon served with the Ordnance Corps in Rotary Wing Group Kandahar, Afghanistan. At this moment, I am proud of my wife and her efforts back home, proud of my country, proud that I'm serving my country, proud of my mate's service, and proud of the sacrifices we all make in order to serve. As the unmistakable thud of the chook taking off resonates around the airfield, I close my eyes and say a little prayer for their team heading out and wish them well as they head into the darkness. I'll catch a couple of hours sleep and do it all over again, because this is what I do and where I want to be. In Afghanistan, Australians and their Afghan allies confronted a ruthless enemy. David Savage, a civilian working with AusAid, was badly wounded by a child suicide bomber. There's no doubt that to recover from such a blast is both a physical and a psychological journey. I think one of the biggest impacts is on the family. They see how vulnerable we really are and the effect of the injury or injuries can have. My wife hasn't been back to work since that time. She's been my full-time carer. It's an ongoing thing and it's an ongoing effect on everyone. Squadron Leader Sarah Brown, commander of an RAAF combat surgical team in Afghanistan, reflected on her service. I awaited their return and tended their wounds, never able to fully comprehend the darkness of a man they encountered on their journey. I witnessed their adrenaline-fueled highs of survival and their immense depths of despair at the loss of a mate. I laughed reservedly at the often black human stories of soldiers who photographed their legs with border patrol, just in case they never saw them again, and faced the reality of their need to loosely wear a tourniquet on each limb, ready to stem the almost inevitable hemorrhage that could end their life. I have been privileged to hear of unimaginable acts of bravery and self-preservation, and I have stood by silently to attempt to pick up the pieces when it all falls apart. I've worn their blood. So many of us have worn their blood. In southern Afghanistan, Australian forces fought their fiercest contact in battles since the Vietnam War. Many of these actions were fought by Australia's Special Forces. A member of the Special Air Service Regiment described the actions of a comrade at Chora Pass in Nuristan in 2006. The boys were taken a pasting. Three-quarters rifle, mortar, machine gun and rocket-propelled grenade fire was pouring in. That's when one of our cars was hit with an RPG. Out of the three of them, he was the only one left unscathed. The crew commander got it the worst. Took some bad shrapnel in the neck and face and fell out of the car. And even with all that fire coming in, he just ran around to the exposed side of the car and picked up his crew commander, put him in the back of the vehicle and held on to him as he drove through the most horrendous fire to get the boys to safety. Mateship at its finest. One of the largest battles was fought in 2010 against Taliban strongholds in the Shah Wali Kot district of Kandahar province in southern Afghanistan. After the action, 2nd Commander Regiment's Sergeant Gary Robinson remarked, "It was tense, hot and arduous. It was kill or be killed. They were trying to kill me, so I have no remorse." Sergeant Brett Till, an explosive ordnance disposal technician from the Incident Response Regiment, was killed while disarming an improvised explosive device in southern Afghanistan on 19th of March 2009. Despite the risks, Warrant Officer Dan Costello reflected on the need to carry on the dangerous work of the engineers. After we put Brett on the helicopter and watched him fly off, I walked back, tears rolling down my face and my glasses on. I said, "Well, what do I do now? I've never done this before. Who prepares for this sort of stuff?" It was Major Wakeman that gave me the confidence to keep going. He said, "Mate, as traumatic as it is losing a mate and Brett's death, there's 144 fellas that need you when we've got a mission to complete. I need you and your men to get us to Helmand." So I had to walk back 44 vehicles to the front of mine, compose myself and get my blokes back in the means to keep going. I said, "Fellas, I'm hurting as much as you are at this stage." I was crying in front of them as well. It's horrific what's happened. I can't put your minds at ease, but I'm going back out front to keep going. There are 144 fellas behind us that are shit scared and won't do anything without us. Who's coming with me? Two blokes put their hands up, Whitey and Jeffro, and off we went. And we kept going all that night. When I got back after that rotation, I met the family. I met Bree, Brett's widow. He had an unborn child he never got to see in his kids. The thing that holds me the most is that I made promises that I couldn't keep. I know now that you can't make those sorts of promises because of war. 30-year-old Private Gregory Shear from the 1st Commander Regiment was killed in a rocket attack in Nuristan province on the 4th of January 2009. Shear had not told his parents he was being deployed to Afghanistan. He had not wanted to worry them. Greg's mother, Yvonne Shear, recently reflected. He was a wonderful son. He was kind and compassionate. He had a wonderful sense of humour and full of fun. He just wanted to get out there and have fun and enjoy life, to contribute to the country, and to, if possible, make a difference to those less fortunate than himself. Greg's father, Willie Shear, remarked, "I was in retrospect disappointed that he didn't have the opportunity to wish him well and wish him the best of luck in this situation. So that's one part that really still hurts and lingers, that I didn't have the opportunity to actually say a proper goodbye." Corporal Cameron Baird, MG of the 2nd Commander Regiment, was killed in the final moments of an assault on a Taliban stronghold in the village of Udak in Uruzgan Province, Afghanistan, in July 2013. For his actions, he was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross for Australia. Just weeks before his death, Baird responded to an Australian high school student in Sydney who had written to him as part of the school pen pal project. His response reads, "My name is Cameron and I'm 32 years old. Sometimes my job is difficult, but I have good reasons to do it. Making the world a safer place for others is one reason. I think we are very lucky in Australia. We are safe, we can live our lives as we wish. Being away from family and friends is difficult, but I've been in the army for over 13 years and have become accustomed to being away." In your letter, you ask some questions. I would like to try and answer them for you. I'm a team commander in an assault platoon. I have a 6-man team within the platoon. My role as a team commander is to lead my team when on missions and during training. We do many different missions in Afghanistan. The main focus is providing security to the community and advising the Afghan police on how to provide security within their job. I've been to Afghanistan a number of times and they're getting better and better each time I come back. Have I always wanted to be in the army? Simple answer is no. As you grow older, things change in your life. So you have to adjust. When I was 12 years old, I wanted to be a footballer or a sportsman, but I wasn't good enough to be professional. Because the army is physical and you work outdoors, I thought it would be good to join. Since joining, I have been really happy with it. I've travelled a lot around Australia training and around the world on operations. And now I have heaps of good mates that I work with. Thank you so much for writing. It was great to hear from you. Remember to stay in school and enjoy while you were there, because when the older you get, the more responsibility and less time you have to play with your friends. Always try your best in whatever you do, and always be happy in your life. Enjoy and have fun.
Ladies and gentlemen, the final projection onto the memorial was in acknowledgement of the Centenary of the Royal Australian Air Force on the 31st of March of this year. Still projecting onto the memorial's dome are the names of more than 102,000 Australians listed on the Roll of Honour in the commemorative area. This nightly commemoration, initially delivered as part of the memorial's program to mark the centenary of the First World War, has been extended to include the names of all Australians who have died during or as a result of war service or warlike operations. Each name reminds us to remember the individual sacrifices made in our name.